Assalamu alaikum students, this is your teacher Muhammad Umar Khatak for the subject Organizational Theory and Behavior, and this is our 20th lecture and chapter number 8. And today the topic of our discussion is the selection process. Step number 2, employment test. A technique that some organizations use to aid their selection decision is the employment test. An employment test is a mechanism, either a paper and a pencil, online test, or a simulation exercise that attempts to measure certain characteristics of individuals. These characteristics range from aptitudes such as manual dexterity to intelligence to personality. It can be very expensive to develop a test to measure these kinds of characteristics. For this reason alone, many employers purchase existing tests from a variety of sources. There are literally thousands of published tests from which to choose, and some of more useful tests can cost as little as $1 per applicant. Anyone interested in selecting a test for use in personal selection or personnel selection can begin with the Mental Measurement Yearbook, which summarizes many of the tests and includes a brief evaluation of their effectiveness. Regardless of whether an organization develops its own test or purchases an existing one, additional costs are associated with using tests in a selection. Any of these devices should be validated before it is actually used to make hiring decisions. However, validation studies are expensive if they are not conducted properly. Job Sample Performance Test. A job sample performance test requires the applicant to actually do a sample of the work that the job involves in a controlled situation. Examples of job performance tests include programming test for computer programmers, standard driving course for delivery persons, standardized typing, word processing, or spreadsheet application problems for administrative assistants. Auditions used by symphony, orchestra, or ballet company. Simulated in-basket test for managers, a standardized test set of memos, emails, and requests, phone calls, and so on is given to the applicant, who must respond to them as she or he would if the work were real. Cognitive and mental ability tests. Over the years, researchers have identified a large number of specific mental abilities for which selection tests are now available. Perhaps the two best known cognitive abilities are math and verbal. These form the basis for such tests as scholastic aptitude tests and the graduate record examination, to name two. Cognitive and mental ability test. Verbal and math abilities are also measured by a variety of tests developed specifically for use in human resource selection. Still, other tests that measure these abilities were developed for use in other areas of psychology, but now have been successfully adopted to selection. Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale. The Wechsler is a comprehensive paper and pencil test of 14 sections grouped into two scores. The verbal score includes journal information, arithmetic, similarities, vocabularies, and other items. The performance score includes picture completion, picture arrangement, object assembly, and similar items. Wonderlic Personnel Test. The Wonderlic uses a variety of perceptual, verbal, and arithmetical items that provide a total score. Other well-known tests include the Differential Aptitude Test, the SRA Primary Mental Ability Test, and Multiple Aptitude Test. California Test of Mental Maturity, adult level. This is a test of mental ability administered to groups and scored by a machine. Scores are developed from a series of short tests on spatial relationship, verbal concepts, logic and reasoning, numerical reasoning, memory, and others. The scores are converted to IQ equivalents and profiles are developed for analyzing performance. Other cognitive tests. There are numerous other examples of cognitive tests that have been used successfully in selection but may not be as well known as measures of verbal and math ability or general intellectual ability. For example, shows an excerpt from a test called Minnesota Paper Form Board Test, which is a measure of spatial relations. Spatial relations refers to an ability to visualize things on paper as they might appear in actual three-dimensional space. An architect or draftsperson must be able to look at a set of blueprints and clearly know what the actual object, building, house, bridge, etc. will look like. Similarly, pilots must be able to quickly orient themselves even when they are flying other than straight and level with ground. Tests of spatial relations have proved effective for these and certain other jobs. Clerical aptitude is another cognitive ability that has proved useful in selecting people for a wide array of jobs. The Minnesota Clerical Test, one of the more popular measures of clerical aptitude. This test requires applicants to rapidly check numbers and names for accuracy. Their ability to rapidly compare entries such as these is a good predictor of many types of job performance, especially in secretarial and clerical jobs. Psychomotor ability simulations. There are a number of tests that measure an applicant's psychomotor abilities, although these are not as popular as they once were. They include choice reaction time, speed of limb movement, and finger dexterity. One of these is O'Connor finger and tweezer dexterity test. The person being tested picks up pins with tweezers and row by row insert them in holes across the board with the hand normally used. These tests are used for positions with high manual requirements such as assembling radios or TV components and watches. Personality inventories and temperament tests. Potentially, the least reliable of the employment tests are instruments that attempt to measure a person's personality or temperament. One of the most frequently used inventories is the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. Other paper and pencil inventories are the California Psychological Inventory, the Minnesota Counseling Inventory, the Manifest Anxiety Scale, and Adverse Personal Preference Schedule. A more optimistic picture of the value of personality inventories comes from efforts to specifically construct a measure for a particular job. That is, some of the disappointing results previously obtained with personality inventories in selection could be attributed to a mismatch between the test and the situation it was being used. The selection process, step number 3, employment interview. Other than application blanks, the interview is definitely the selection technique most often encountered by persons applying for a job. Not surprisingly, the topic of interviews have generated hundreds of research studies over the past 20 years, covering such topics as verbal, nonverbal behavior, personality characteristic, impression management, interviewer-interviewee similarity, and pre-interview impressions. Two strategies for making the most out of an interview are structuring the interview to be reliable and valid, and training managers to use the best available interviewing techniques. Types of interview. Employment interviews vary along at least two important dimensions: how structured the interview is, and whether it focuses on historical information about the applicant or attempts to place the applicant in hypothetical situations to assess how she or he might respond in the future. An unstructured interview has no predetermined script or protocol. Questions are not prepared in advance. There is no attempt to guarantee that applicants are asked the same question. Typically, the interviewer does not have a scoring protocol either. When used by some highly skilled interviewer, the unstructured interview may lead to useful insights about an applicant. However, substantial research over the past 30 years indicate that structured interviews, regardless of their specific format, will generally be more reliable and valid than unstructured interviews. During the structured interview, the interviewer has a standardized list of questions to ask of all applicants. These questions should have been generated with the aid of a thorough job analysis in order to identify specific types of information sought during the interview. The importance of structure in the interview is further understood by the fact that standardization should lower the possibility that intentional or unintentional biases held by the interviewer will affect the outcomes of the process. This, in turn, should lead to less differential impact on women and minorities, and a better chance for the organization to successfully defend itself if it happens to be sued. The second dimension along which interviews can vary is whether they focus on past experiences and behavior or on hypothetical future behavior. In recent years, two types of structured interviews have emerged and gained popularity in the United States. The first, behavioral description interview (BDI) asks applicants to relate actual incidents from their past relevant work experience to the job for which they are applying. BDIs, behavioral description interview, are based on the assumption that the past is the best predictor of the future. An example of this type of interview question would be: thinking back to your last job, tell me about a time when you resolved a conflict with a customer. Follow up questions would include: what was the outcome? And how did you control your frustration? The situational interview (SI) also seeks to identify whether an applicant possesses relevant job knowledge and motivation, but it achieves this goal in a different manner. SI questions encourage applicants to respond to hypothetical situations they might encounter on the job for which they applied. For example, an applicant for pharmaceutical sales position might be asked, if one of the physicians in your sales territory asked you to provide supporting research and other documentation regarding the efficacy of a new drug, how would you go about finding the information? Responses to this and other hypothetical questions are then scored according to their appropriateness for the job. Overall, research findings on situational interviews indicate that questions about past experience have higher validity than the future-oriented hypothetical questions. However, future-oriented questions can also be useful if used properly. Despite recent optimism about the validity of employment interviews, many questions about their effectiveness remain unanswered. For years, there have been significant concerns that interviewers may differ considerably in their accuracy and that potential for bias always exists, since the interview relies so heavily on personal judgment. Errors such as these have been the focus of many training programs for interviewers. Generally speaking, however, properly designed training programs do seem capable of reducing many of the errors found in traditional unstructured interviews. This appears to be especially true when the training is used in conjunction with the structured interview format. Training can provide managers with a better understanding of how to ask questions, how to properly record applicants' responses, and to some extent, how to be aware of potential biases. Moreover, recent evidence suggests that when a trained interviewer takes behaviorally oriented notes during the interview, validity can be enhanced. Now, let's look at some common errors that can occur in the employment interview. Excessive talking by the interviewer that limits the amount of job related information obtained from the interviewees. Inconsistency in the questions used with the applicants, which results in different types of information being gathered from each applicant. Asking questions that are either unrelated or only slightly related to performance on the job. Inability to put the interviewee at ease during the interview, making it difficult to gather spontaneous or follow-up information. Overconfidence in the interviewer's ability to evaluate applicants, which result in hasty decisions. Stereotyping applicants and allowing personal biases to influence evaluation. Being influenced by non-verbal behavior of the applicants. Rating many applicants the same in evaluation, such as superior, leniency error, average, central tendency error, or poor, stringency error. Allowing one or two either good or bad characteristics of an applicant to influence the evaluation of all other characteristics, which is also called the halo effect. Allowing the quality of the applicants who preceded the present applicant to influence the ratings of the present applicant, which is also known as the contrast effect. Making an evaluation of the applicant within the first minutes of the interview, first impression error. Favorably evaluating an applicant because he or she is similar to the interviewer in some ways, similar to me error. This is the end of the lecture. Thank you.